Hello and welcome. This is Guy Glidden. This is lesson 3 and a set of 4 lessons provided on screencast to help you with Excel skills. Lesson 1 was the basics. In lesson 2, I demonstrated some uses of wizard functions and helped to set up pivot table. This is lesson 3. It's all going to be about the pivot table. Now this chart should also help you because I'll start out with a reminder. During lesson 2, I provided some specific examples of things you could do with Function Wizard, and the terminology is important to go into that little menu. So average, median, STDEV for standard deviation, and Pearson are all tools you can use to provide an arithmetic, mean or average, a middle case for the median, a standard deviation, and a correlation coefficient for 2 variables that you're going to see again demonstrated when we compare on a couple of data sets that I have. Proficiency level expressed at a percent above or at or above a certain performance level, and poverty level expressed as a percent eligible for free and reduced lunch. Let's get busy because this is all about pivot table, and I want to make sure I don't get lost in the amount of time. And when we left the process before, and I need to go back over here because I'm having you in middle land, I was all in the set up a pivot table, and I wanted to set up a pivot table again because there are a couple things I wasn't very clear on about here. One was, so let me set up the pivot table again. To set up a pivot table, number one, make sure your cursor is on a symmetrical set of data. Symmetrical means that all of the columns are labeled, all of the rows are labeled, and you don't have any data sticking around someplace that you don't have labeled and don't have organized. So you're going to go check that out, and then you're going to go up to Insert, and you're going to go to Pivot Table, and if all works well, it's going to look something like this, and you're going to see a pivot table floating menu, and it's going to have a suggested table or range identified, as this one does. You're going to go over and you're going to visually verify this, which you can do because you're going to see the little moving dotted line. That's around the range that's suggested by Excel for the pivot table. And my range says Reading School 101, that's the name of the sheet. A1 is the upper left-hand corner, and it is. M101 is the bottom right-hand corner, and that's what it is. If I can get to it quickly enough, you can see that. So that's what I want to do, and when it does it, the second thing I neglected to mention to you is your pivot table is going to look like this, but it's going to be on a new sheet. So it's not going to be on the same sheet. It's going to create a new sheet for you for the pivot table. So and if you get this little menu on the left-hand side of the page and this little menu on the right-hand side of the page, congratulations, you got a pivot table. So that should give you some clues. Now let's go ahead and do some demonstration. The first thing we want to do is to verify something you're going to want to do, and you want to organize some data, and we're going to help you set up a frequency distribution. And I'm going to do it for narrative test scores, and I'm going to pull narrative down underneath the values because that simply says that's a piece of data I want to do something with. Narrative test scores. Now it comes up as sum, and for me to change the sum to another value, I can simply use a left mouse control, go to value settings, and I have the choices to change it to the things on this menu. For this purpose, I want to go to count. I'm going to go to count, and all it did, I'll not show you the little thing on the other side of the screen, but it simply says the count is 100. 100 test scores, you knew that. Here's the important part of setting a frequency distribution. I take the same icon, narrative, and I draw it down to the row labels so that I'm used to have narrative both in the values section and the row labels. And when I do that, I have created a frequency distribution. And it's called a frequency distribution because you have the distribution shows the number of actual earned test scores in this group. 41 is the lowest, 51, 54, and so forth until we get to, I think, probably one score that's a little bit above 100. And the frequency part comes from the fact that for each of these values, it shows the number of cases. So 2 students out of 54, 6 out of 77, and so on and so forth. Now, I did it over here by putting it in the row labels. Question, could I have done this in the column labels as well? You sure can. I'm going to move it over here. But this is what it's going to look like, and as you can see, having a vertical column that looks like this probably isn't going to be very manageable. So I'll change this back to row labels, and you'll appreciate that's going to make it easier to do. Now let me show you a nice visual thing to provide some data we've seen before, but it is going to organize it a little bit. Let me take this. I am going to make a copy of the pivot table, and I'm going to go in and paste that right here. Now I'm going to paste the pivot table, and it simply creates another pivot table. That's another way. But for this second pivot table, I want to change the functions quite a bit here because I want to do something to show you some neat comparisons of this data sheet. And this is important, so I'm going to remove narrative from the modifier label. I'm going to go down here and I'm going to change the count for narrative from count to average. I'm going to hit the button, and okay, here we have an average of 85.21. Now that's not a big deal, you've seen that before, but here's what I'm going to do with that. I'm going to pull that down, and I am going to put that right beside my frequency distribution so it's right next to the point of 85 on the distribution. And there you go, and you can see it right there. And sorry, I didn't do that right. I want to show you something here, and I did that wrong. I want to go in and paste special, and I want to do, my screen is in my way, hang on me guys. I want to change this to values only, and then I hit the OK button. What I've done is I've removed the value, the numbers from the pivot table. That's important because I don't want the pivot table function replicated. So now that kind of tells me, and I'll highlight this number right here, that tells me that's where my arithmetic average is. Let's go back up again. This time I'm going to change this, and I can also change this by going up here and using a right mouse up here. So I got several places I can do that. Now I'm going to change this to a standard deviation. And that tells me I have a standard deviation of 11.1. And that's not new information, but if I take this and by my calculation, that means that the point on the scale, which is standard deviation -1, is about 74. So let's just do a little rough estimate here and put the values thing right here. So it's kind of, well, we can't do a 70, somewhere between a 73 and a 75. Okay, and then let's go scroll that down a little bit more, guys. And let's paste the same information. If we think an 85.21 plus an 11.1, we're going to be somewhere around a 96-ish or so. So let's do it again down here. But again, you know, it doesn't want me to do that. It wants me to do it again. Sorry about that, guys. Sometimes it's being a hard ass. Okay, so we're going to make a copy of that again. Going to come down and scroll that down all the way down so you can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to do a paste special again. I'm going to do the value section again. And that shows me, okay, now by doing that, that kind of shows me that people who have scores below a 74, that's 73 on 1, and the high test scores are kind of the outliers. I'm probably not worried so much about the high scores, their high achievements. I might be a little more concerned about these guys that are down over here. Those are low scores. That would be a quick way to identify. All I do now is need to match those number scores up with kids in that range, and I know a good group to start to work with. Okay, enough of that. I want to move on because I don't want to waste all my time. Demonstrated to do a frequency distribution, a few things you can do with that. Let me delete some of this stuff and then jump from the thing. And I'm going to go up here again. Now I'm going to go back down. I'm going to modify this again. Let me show you what I'm doing here. Because now I'm going to show you the heavy hitting part of pivot table that you really need to be able to do. And by doing this, I'm going to take the narrative modifier out. Goes back to count. Now I'm going to change count to an average, just for the purpose of demonstration, and put it over there. Now, if I scroll over here quickly, that simply tells you that that's an average of 85.21, not a big deal. But now look what happens when I do some additional modification. So suppose I take the rice icon and I bring it down to the row labels. And just that quickly, I've now developed averages for all of the subgroups racially in the distribution. Now, I don't think I need to bring the thing over here. I'm going to do exactly the same thing I did, only with gender. I'm going to pull that down to the column labels, and look what happens. Now I have averages for males and females in each of the racial groups. I started with one piece of data, which was this right here, 85.21. Now I have, well, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I have about 28 or 30 averages on that sheet. Now, for the purposes of doing a comparison, I'm going to make a copy of that. I'm going to put it down here below. I am going to do a paste special. I'm going to take the values. So now I have this little sheet down here, and I have reduced the values, and I've removed them from the pivot table. And the reason I did that is I'm going to go up here, and I can do it up here without going over to the other sheet, so it's kind of redundant. By using the right mouse up here, I want to go to Value Field Settings. I want to change that to Account. And what I've done now is I'm making a copy of that, pasting it right down here beside here, using Paste Special again. That's really a handy indicator. Now I have count, and I have average for the groups. I know what the averages were. I know how many subjects contributed to those averages. That's a pretty handy piece of information to have. And that's the kind of information we can use for some other purposes here. Now let me do one other thing here, and I'm going to do this one rather quickly here. I'm just removing these things from the icon list here, so you don't need to use those. Okay, now I'm going to go down, because you notice I told you earlier I had a performance level indicator down here, and I have sum of performance indicator, which I put up there. I'm going to use my left mouse, sorry, the right mouse up here, to modify that to account. 100 scores. Now if I go over here and I modify this by taking performance score and also putting it down here, if I know what the categories are, I can tell that 1, which is the lowest performance category, there were 8 people there, there were 5 in the highest performance category. I'm sorry, I'm not showing you this. Here's the information by performance category. Okay. Now, I could do the same information, and so you want to see what this means, but it's not going to be in a pretty order here. And it's not going to allow me to do that without, if I were to change this, okay, it's going to force me to redo this again here a little bit. Here's what happened when I put this in a performance definition mode. That's the same thing, only now it shows by the categories. If they're not in order, because it doesn't show them in order from lowest to highest. These are some pretty valuable uses of pivot table to help you organize data.